Coming up next on the Connecticut Network, a statesman's legacy, historic triumphs and failures, and a lifetime of distinguished public service. I'm Diane Smith. Join me at Connecticut's Old State House for a conversation with Senator Chris Dodd.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're so pleased that you could come. My name is Sally Whipple. I'm the Director of Education at the Connecticut Public Affairs Network, and we're charged with providing educational programming at the Old State House. As you can see, this is a very impressive building, and not just because of the architecture, although that's pretty good. It's an impressive building because of all of the many activities and events that have taken place within these walls over the years. This building started out as a seat of government for Connecticut in 1796, and it served in that capacity till 1878. So for 83 years, men, and only men, from all over Connecticut served here as legislators, as governors, and as justices and government officials. And for 83 years, the people of Connecticut came to this building to act as jurors, to get justice through our justice system, to express their opinions, and to watch their state government at work. It's always been an open and welcoming building for the public, and we continue to carry on those traditions today. At the Old State House now, we provide school and public programs for thousands of people from Connecticut and also from around the world. We have a very heavy traffic in foreign visitors, which is wonderful for the Old State House and for Hartford. Our exhibits, our school programs, our events, our tours, our monthly panels, which I know some of you have been to, explain how state government works, provide context for issues that we face in Connecticut today, and they also provide models of people who acted as very powerful, active citizens throughout the history of Connecticut. We like showing those people like P.T. Barnum, Noah Webster, people like those who served in this building and provide good models of citizenship for us today. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing two people who I think are great models of active and powerful citizenship. They've done a lot for the state of Connecticut. The first person I'm going to introduce is Diane Smith, who will lead our conversation with Senator Dodd today. Ms. Smith has moderated many panel discussions at the Old State House as part of our lecture series, and she has also anchored the Connecticut Network's coverage of this past year's election activities from primaries through the inauguration. I would also like to introduce the chairman of the board of the Connecticut Public Affairs Network, Pat Sheehan. Mr. Sheehan met Senator Dodd when his arrival at Channel 3 coincided with the senator's first congressional run about 40 years ago. So for nearly 4 decades, these two have traveled parallel paths, with Mr. Sheehan chronicling Senator Dodd's career from the earliest days of his political involvement to the present. We're very pleased to have you here. We're very pleased to have the Senator here. Happy to have Diane Smith here, and also Pat Sheehan to introduce the Senator. And thank you so much for coming again.
Thank you, Sally, and thank you all for being here. We're really honored to have Senator Dodd in this wonderful building, the building that Connecticut was tested so often in during the early years of the Republic, and which still today serves as a facility where we come together to commemorate, celebrate the contributions of Connecticut's people and Connecticut's leaders as we do today. Historians will take a look at Christopher Dodd's career and opine on that in the generations to come, but I can tell you as someone who has witnessed his 40-year public life that Christopher Dodd is going to be remembered in Connecticut not for the length of his service, but for the enormity of his contributions to Connecticut, but even more so to the United States of America and to citizens around the world. It's very easy to say that he was the son of a senator, and I think that people sometimes identify Christopher Dodd, at least those of us in Connecticut, as, oh, well, he was Tom Dodd's son. But Chris Dodd was not born to a senator. His father was a federal prosecutor when Chris was born in 1944. His father had been a special agent in the FBI, and when Chris was just 1 year old, his father went off to Germany to be a part of the prosecutorial team for the Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg. When Chris was 3, his father came back to Connecticut to set up a law practice here in Hartford and got involved in Connecticut Democratic politics. Chris was 8 years old when his father ran for Congress and won in 1952, the first of 2 terms. Christopher was 12 years old when his father ran for the United States Senate and lost. Tom Dodd came back 2 years later, ran and won. And at that age, just recognize what age we're talking about. At that age, Chris would have been 14 years old. He graduated from high school not in Connecticut, but down in suburban Maryland. After he graduated from high school, he went on to college at Providence College, came back to New England. He and I were both class of 1962 and 1966 as we look at our high school and college careers, so I know all of what was going on in the world those days. Think of yourself when you were 14 or 15 years old and what kind of person you were. So he was a young man who was inspired, though, when in his public service. He was inspired by the words of President Kennedy and certainly by the example of his own family and his father's service to the nation. In 1966, when he graduated from Providence, Chris went off and joined the Peace Corps, spent 2 years in the Dominican Republic, learning what service is really all about, serving other people, giving of yourself. He learned a foreign language. He immersed himself in doing good work for folks. Came back to the United States in 1968, which was a pretty tumultuous year in this country. Went into law school at the University of Louisville, enlisted for a 6-year term in the Army Reserves. I actually first met Christopher not when Sally mentioned, although I told her that's where our public careers came together, but I first met him in 1970. It was during his father's final election campaign. It was a bitter time for Democrats in Connecticut and all over the country. Anti-war candidates were running against established senators. Tom Dodd was denied the Democratic nomination, ran as an independent, and he lost that election. Tragically, though, it wasn't just the election that Tom Dodd lost. When he left the Senate in early 1971, Tom Dodd passed away in May of that year, and his son was 26 years old, just 3 days shy of his birthday, his 27th birthday. So when you think about Christopher Dodd and his commitment to public service and his decision to get into public service, think of that young man who had witnessed what he had witnessed at that age, had committed himself to public service. And so when we arrive in 1974, this was a tested young man. He ran for the nomination in the 2nd Congressional District in 1974 against another famous son of a famous Democrat in Connecticut, John Bailey's son, John being, of course, the state party chairman, the former national party chairman. His son, Jack, ran at the convention against Chris for the nomination. Christopher prevailed in that and won the first of 3 terms in the United States House of Representatives. In 1978, he was on the Select Committee on Assassinations, which gave us more insight into the murders of JFK and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. 1980 came along, and Abe Ribicoff, who was the senior senator, Abe Ribicoff announced that he was not going to run for election. And I can remember sitting in a watering hole with Christopher Dodd at that time and having this discussion about whether he or Toby Moffett would be running for Senator Ribicoff's seat. Chris Dodd, as he always has been able to do, was able to prevail, let's put it that way, prevail in that contest before it became a contest. And he went on to win the nomination and the election in 1980. He won his re-election in 1986, again in 92, again in 98, and again in 2004. We could always tell when Chris was running for re-election, he would come home with a haircut. He has and still has that wonderful mane, but when he was in Washington between elections, it just seemed to get a lot longer and shaggier, and he'd be around the world and meeting with international leaders, and you can see some of the photographs on the slides here. But when he would come home with that nice tight haircut, you'd say to yourself, ha, Senator Dodd's running for re-election. Oh, haven't made a decision yet. His barber knew. Chris Dodd almost ran for president. He did eventually make a presidential run. He also was selected by President Clinton to become the chairman of the Democratic National Party, which put him on the road for 2 years in the mid-1990s. I think he probably visited every state. He raised millions, tens of millions of dollars for the candidates and the causes in which he believed and to which he was committed. And he also made friends all over the country, as he had already all around the world. He also married his lovely Jackie in 1999. They have 2 beautiful daughters. It's interesting because at one time early in his career, he was referred to as the children's senator. His legislation on behalf of children still stands today. He also was a great advocate of human rights and of civil rights. In the foreign relations field, he has affected people from South Africa to India, to Northern Ireland, and throughout Latin America, where his real legacy of service in foreign relations will be remembered. As someone who understood the culture, understood the language, he could sit down and chat with Fidel Castro or Daniel Ortega and could make meaningful contributions to the American policy regarding this close region to us. Little known outside of Washington, perhaps, Christopher Dodd also has been a keeper of the flame at the United States Senate. He is someone who appreciates, understands, and reveres the traditions of the United States Senate as an institution, and he sorely will be missed. I think it's the architect's office down there, I believe, that keeps the Senate. But Christopher has been, indeed, one of the strongest voices about the tradition and the unique position of the United States Senate. Looking back over the decades, you probably will see legislation that goes through so many different fields, but I will say that his longest-lasting contributions will probably be those that were cited by the New York Times last month when they pointed out the capstone legislation of the recent banking reform bill. But it really is just the culmination of 30 years of interest in protecting the financial interests of consumers around this country. Early in his career, he took this on as a cause, and he is, I say this as someone who works in the financial industry myself today, he is probably the most knowledgeable person in Washington about what goes on in our financial markets and in our financial system. Again, his counsel will be missed. Unlike some of his Washington colleagues, Chris Dodd was always available, accessible. Not intrusively so, but accessible. Accessible to the media, accessible to other public officials, accessible to his constituents, always available to the people he represented. It's not easy to live your entire life in the public's eye, but Chris Dodd has done that. There are times you just want to have a drink or go play golf or play with your family or have a donut fight. Who knows? These kinds of things happen, but it's difficult when you try and do that in the public eye. And so, as we turn to Senator Dodd and Diane to reflect on his career, I say to Christopher Dodd, thank you so much for the 40 years that you've devoted of your life to the public here in the state of Connecticut.
Thanks.
Thank you.
That said it all. That was very nice. Thank you. Thank you.
If there are any people who are still looking for seats, we have a few sprinkled through. We'd love to have you come and get more comfortable. And thank you all for being here today. It's so nice to be able to be here in this historic building. Senator, I guess the way we start is when the Senate session began this year in January, a couple of weeks ago, for the first time in 30 years, you were not part of it. How did that feel?
Well, it's different. I mean, there are three emotions. First of all, thank you, and Pat, thank you. I don't know what left to say after that introduction. You kind of covered all the ground, including that donut fight. Thanks for remembering that. So people have forgotten that 35 years ago. But and great to be in this building. And let me just say to those involved in the old State House, I've been in this room so many times. Debates. One of my senatorial debates was in this very room. I debated either Jarvis or Gahn. Those who are old remember the Jarvis-Gahn referendum in California, going back about 25, 30 years ago, on budgetary matters, and he was roaming around the country debating people, and we actually had a debate one afternoon in this very room, so back in this building many times, and this is one of the great treasures of the state. So, Diane, I apologize, and thank all of you for coming. In fact, my sister Carolyn is here, and former staff and former employees and co-workers and so forth are gathered in this room today, so it's fun to be here with all of you. And the emotions, you could have had three emotions. I thought about this a lot coming up to January 5th, 2 weeks ago. The first would have been, why didn't I do this 10 years earlier? And I didn't have that emotion at all in terms of why didn't I step out earlier. The second would have been, I ran and I lost, and I'm bitter, I'm furious with my constituents and everyone else because they should have known better and didn't appreciate me, whatever it was. And that wasn't the case at all. And the third was, I'm really sad leaving a place I love. And that's the emotion I had more than anything else. I had a great experience being in the Senate, revere the institution, as Pat pointed out, have great affection for the people I served with, developed a strong, I don't remember a single colleague that I served with that I didn't have a good relationship with. I was thinking of Jesse Helms when Jesse passed away. I was the only Democrat to show up at his funeral, and I always felt badly about that, because while I disagreed with Jesse Helms, I can't think of an issue we agreed on, frankly, over the years. But a good person, a gentleman in many ways. We developed a good personal relationship. And to me, that was the essence, in a way, in public life. We talk a lot about this today in light of the tragedy in Tucson. But I've been a great advocate throughout my career that this is, particularly in legislative bodies, you owe your constituency, you owe the public at large, the hardest work you can provide for them. And you don't enjoy the luxury, or shouldn't enjoy a luxury, of having friends and enemies. It's really working with people, even people you may disagree with. And so that was the emotion I sensed that January 5th day. I walked Dick Blumenthal down the aisle as the new senator, which is a tradition. I think I made it nervous when he called and asked me to do it. I said, now that you've been elected and you're an elected senator-elect, I can tell you what this ceremony is all about. And you can't tell anybody what I'm going to tell you, I said, however. This has been a Senate secret for 230 years. When you walk down the aisle, it's actually a marriage ceremony. And there was a slight pause, I think, as Dick thought about this and realized. So, and then walked out of the chamber. So those are the emotions.
We did build this as an intimate conversation with Senator Dodd, and you know, when you're getting intimate with Senator Dodd, you have to have at least 100 people in the room because everybody wants to be part of it, and I promised them that they would be able to ask you questions. Good. So we're going to talk for a little while, and then I'll be opening it up to the floor for questions. We will try to get a microphone near you, but we might not be able to get close enough since we had an overflow crowd, so I'll encourage you to stand up and ask those questions, but we're going to talk for a few minutes. This really struck me. I was reading a column by E.J. Dionne that he wrote, I think it was in December, and he said, the happiness quotient in the Senate will drop when Chris Dodd leaves. And what he was talking about was something that I've always noticed about you, Senator. You're so joyful about your work. How do you maintain that over 40 years?
Well, first of all, what an incredible privilege the people of this state have given me. I mean, I can never begin to adequately thank them for having sent me 8 times to the Congress, 3 terms in the House and 5 in the United States Senate. How do you ever say thank you to a state for giving you that incredible honor to represent their interests, as difficult as it is and contentious as the times have been? And there have been 1,900 people who served in the United States Senate in the history of our country. About 12,000 have served in the Congress over that same period of time. And so to be given the privilege of being one of those people to actually get down and debate and engage in the great issues of our day and for our country is something that I can never, as I say, adequately express my gratitude to the people of the state for. And also the opportunity to engage in a remarkable process. It's such an incredible country when you think of the genius of those who gathered in this room, in this building, on this very ground, the fundamental orders in 1636, embracing the fundamental concept never expressed ever before in any written document, that people have a right to choose those who govern them. That started here on this very property where we're gathered here today. And so talking about a sense of joy may be a bit of an exaggeration, but it's certainly the sense of having an opportunity to participate in a continuation of that concept and idea is something. How else could you be but joyful about the opportunity to be having the free-flowing debate, engaging in ideas, trying to make this a more perfect union that our founders envisioned more than 2 centuries ago. So that was always on my mind. And putting together a legislative process, trying to get a bill passed, I always found it intriguing to sort of determine what motivated people. One of my great the professors, if you will, in all of this was Ted Kennedy, who passed away a year and a half ago, and a great personal friend. But he was a genius to watch at this, in a way. I always remember that some of the Republican leadership would get so furious because Teddy ended up getting so many bills passed. So they used to try and send who can we send over to be a part of that committee who would just, be tough on him and not let him get away with this again, And Teddy would he'd have a dinner at the beginning of each Congress and have several during the session. And he'd invite members, Republicans and Democrats, to gather. And his question was always the same. He'd ask each one of us around the table, what would you like to do in this Congress? What do you care about? What interests you? What would you like to see happen? And invariably what he'd do is he'd give everyone a chance to work on that issue. And how could you get angry at a chairman of a committee who was willing to give everyone a chance to try and work on something they cared about? And so even those who were most hostile to him in many ways turned out to become some of his greatest allies in the legislative process. So that brings a certain amount of joy, I guess, to the debate.
When I was asking people as we were getting ready for this interview, what's the thing you most want to know from Chris Dodd now, they said, what's his day like now that he doesn't get up and go to the Senate? What's a typical day for Senator Dodd?
Well, with a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old, my wife has a lot more time to spend some time with those girls. And it is different, obviously. Everyone told me it would be, and there's no halfway house, there's no transition period here, there's no... they send you, well, probably should be to some degree. They go in and sort of teach you all of a sudden that you're working your BlackBerry or whatever else it is with your thumbs here, trying to send messages and get startled. And it's certainly I was prepared for it. I think it's having made up my own mind not to seek re-election, not that it was going to be a guarantee by any stretch of the imagination, but having made that decision, there is a difference. I was talking to some former colleagues. I've talked to a lot of them over the last year. Those who were asked to leave because they went through a rough election and lost have a harder time in many ways than those who made the decision themselves, I think, to move on. And so I'm not looking back, as I said earlier, with that kind of bitterness you might feel, whether justified or not, that people have. And so this is fine. This is everyone I've talked to is enjoying their lives. They've loved the work, by and large, that they engaged in, and are finding areas where they take whatever talents and abilities they have and put them to good use, whether it's serving in public sector provisions and academic institutions. Chuck Hagel, a wonderful friend of mine, the former Republican senator from Nebraska, is teaching at Georgetown University. George Mitchell, of course, was engaged in the conflict in Northern Ireland and now deeply involved in the Middle East and while very difficult, enjoying that immensely. Sam Nunn, a wonderful colleague of mine from Georgia, former senator, former chairman of the Armed Services Committee, got very involved in nuclear proliferation issues and is making a huge difference in that regard. So different people are doing different things, and I think finding that place where you have a level of comfort and where you can take some of the knowledge and experience you've had and bring it to bear. So that's what I'm doing right now, is trying to find that where is that spot that'll give you that sense of satisfaction that all of us seek in life.
I think a lot of us know what you will miss about being in the Senate, but what will you not miss? It's again the laborious kind of caucuses and so forth you go to that can go on indefinitely, it seems, and
that aspect of it. Last Sunday or so, my 5-year-old and 9-year-old were in a violin concert. I hesitate to use the word concert, but it was, for those of you who are parents in the room who have been through these, I know what that feeling was like. On a stage at a high school in Washington. And I thought afterwards, coming out and watching them up there, a year or two ago, I probably would have been some event here at home, back in the state, that someone wanted you to be at, and again, because that's what your job is, probably would have missed that, I suspect, or events like that. And I hope in these coming years that I'll be able to be attending more of those things. And those are the things that I won't miss in that general sense. Not that I didn't enjoy the events and so forth in the state, but the notion. An important point in this too, and I know as we're talking here today, and Diane, that Joe Lieberman, my colleague in the Senate, is making an announcement about stepping out of the Senate, and I have great respect for Joe. We had a wonderful working relationship and friendship in the Senate. But I think Joe feels the way as I do. We talked last night about this, and the sense is, if you're not really willing to come up here and be here on that Sunday at that event, because you're also getting a little tired, you owe it to the people of the state to step aside. This is a hard job. It takes a lot of time. There are people in this audience here today who serve in public life in our state. You see Denise Merrill and Don Williams, a former Dodd staffer, by the way, going back, and that sense of being there. If you're not willing to do that, you owe it to the people of the state to step aside and let someone else do this. And that's a very important element in my view. So I'm not going to miss those things too much, but I'm really going to enjoy what I'm going to fill the space with. And that's, I hope, watching these two little girls grow up, and that might have been difficult. As I talk to my colleagues whose families have grown, how many events they missed, how many athletic contests, how many concerts that they missed growing up, they regret. So that's the part I won't miss.
You brought up Senator Lieberman. You had such a close relationship for so long, and yet so many Democrats felt so upset with him, particularly after he spoke at the Republican convention. Some people saw that almost as treason to the Democratic Party. How did you maintain a relationship with him after that, and how was your relationship affected?
Well, first of all, we've been friends for 40 years. When Joe was a state senator, we were friends then. He ran for Congress in 1980 and lost that congressional race to Larry DeNardis in the New Haven area, and then came to then was Attorney General, and then, of course, went to the Senate. So we served together for 22 years in the Senate. And again, just a good working relationship on matters involving the state. And on a personal level, and there are always going to be things that you'll have differences with. I mean, if you sit there and you take stock, and if you're going to allow any one single event or occasion to sort of dominate a relationship, then you're going to have a very difficult time, in my view, in maintaining the kind of relationships you need to. So I understand and respect people who are disappointed, and Joe is not unfamiliar or certainly not unaware of those emotions. But my relationship with Joe is much deeper, much broader, much more involved than whether or not you showed up at an event or not, or participated in something that I might not have done. But I certainly, I'm not going to sever a relationship with someone because of that. Certainly not after the many years we've been together and worked together. And I have a lot of admiration for Joe. He's done a lot of good things for our state, tremendous things for our state. And my hope is that people look at this thing, they'll look at the totality of it over the years, his contribution to Connecticut, and not be making judgments merely on one or two occasions where there were significant disagreements. That's really not how this ought to happen.
Senator, in spite of the fact that we're such a tiny state, in part because of your stature and your longevity and your taking the lead on so many important issues, you gave us a very big voice in the federal government. Who connects for Connecticut now? How do we go on without that big voice?
Well, I was thinking this morning, and Dick Blumenthal, who I walked down that aisle a couple of weeks ago, he's been in the Senate 2 weeks, and he's about to become the senior senator from Connecticut. I mean, that's the only example I can cite. I always remember Fritz Hollings of South Carolina. I served with Fritz for almost 30 years, and of course his colleague was Strom Thurmond, who I think was elected with Roger Sherman, I think, and he was always the junior senator forever with Strom, who was there until he was 100. But it changes. And first of all, we got wonderful members of our House delegation. First of all, you've got Rosa DeLauro and John Larson from this district up here in Hartford. who is in the head of the caucus, Democratic caucus. Rose is in the leadership. Chris Murphy and Joe Courtney are in very critical positions as well. Jim Himes is a new member, but highly regarded and respected. And the Senate is changing. There are 13 new members that came in this election this year. Half of the United States Senate today is in their first term. So it's not as if we're sending people in where the bulk of the Senate has been there for 25 or 30 years. It's going to happen now almost an entire Senate is changing. And so actually, if you had to pick a time for changes, this isn't a bad time for it, and that we're not waiting some time. These members will pick up. And they're terribly bright. First of all, Dick Blumenthal is tremendously talented. We know him in the state. He's been an excellent attorney general and served in the state legislature, gets this, understands it. He's already being seen as someone that can actually be a very good senator very quickly, in my view. And again, there'll be a contest, obviously, in 2012. And again, the state, I think, has a reputation of civility. We've had our moments and so forth, but we have a style to ourselves in the state that I think we want reflected in the people we elect to high public office. And so I'm quite confident this will be a good, healthy debate. This will be a great venue right here in the old State House to have a series of conversations about what the next senator from Connecticut ought to be doing, and maybe encourage the State House to engage in that conversation. Not so much a contest, a debate back and forth, but come and tell us what you think ought to happen in our state over the next couple of years. Might be an interesting model for the rest of the country to develop as we go through long election cycles. Mm-hmm. So I think we're going to be fine. I remember when Abe Ribicoff left in 1980, a lot of the same issues were being raised, that we were losing a lot of seniority in the Senate. Lowell Weicker was in pretty much just into his second term in the Senate when I arrived, and yet I think you pick things up and things move along. So I'm not worried about it, and the state ought not to be worried about that.
Senator, Pat Sheehan mentioned your father, Thomas Dodd, who had a brilliant career, first as an FBI agent who chased John Dillinger, then as a prosecutor who prosecuted the Ku Klux Klan in the 30s, prosecuted, of course, most famously the war criminals at Nuremberg. Then, of course, he was a congressman and a senator from Connecticut. What did his life, both implicitly and explicitly, teach you about how you wanted to live your life?
Well, a lot of things. First, I mentioned my sister Carolyn's here, who taught for many years. In fact, the last teaching job was at the Kennelly School here in the city of Hartford and helped revive the American Montessori system of teaching. My brother Tom is still teaching at Georgetown University, as well as an educator. Mary Ruttenberg is here, who worked with my father, and his office is here in Connecticut, so there's a lot of family and connections that go back over those many, many years. And it was more by example. I mean, I think growing up around our dining room table, there was a lot of conversation about Nuremberg and about what happened over and over again, to the extent when again, in those days, how often he was there for those dining room conversations. It wasn't every night, obviously, because he was out and about, but nonetheless, when those events did occur, there was a lot of that conversation around our table. And he set by example as well as life. I remember when he was asked, Diane, Sue Nichols, really go back here now in dates. Sue Nichols was a reporter for the New Haven Register. Pat, maybe remember Sue Nichols. And she interviewed my father about 2 or 3 weeks before he died in May of 1971. I remember sitting in the house in Old Lyme and listening to the interview. I wasn't paying much attention to it, but she asked him a question that caused me to put down whatever I was looking at or reading and thought, that's a pretty good question. I wonder how I'll answer it. And the question was, you've just lost an election. You were censured by your colleagues. Painful moment for you, for your family. And yet you had these other experiences in your life. If you had to do it over again, would you do it again? I thought, boy, that's interesting. I wonder how I'll answer that question. And before I could put down whatever I was looking at, he said, I'd do it again in a minute. He said, there's no other calling in life like public service, where you have an opportunity to do as much as you're capable of doing for as many people. Doctors can have only so many patients, lawyers only so many clients, teachers only so many students, but a well-motivated public elected official can affect the lives of millions and millions of people by doing good things. And I would never give up again the opportunity to do some good things for people. I thought it was a remarkable answer. I remember to this day. And as much as a motivation, I thought if he could say that in light of what he's been through, then this must be a worthwhile pursuit. And so those kind of lessons, I think, are invaluable.
You mentioned how his elective career came to a disappointing end. And when you published his letters from Nuremberg just on the eve of your presidential run, there was a story in the New York Times from a reporter who said that Chris Dodd has been on a quest for his father's redemption.
No, you ought to be institutionalized if that had motivated you to spend 40 years of your life in a redemption cycle. I don't. First, I didn't need it. I mean, as you generously and Pat generously pointed out, a remarkable life. When he graduated from Yale Law School, he became a state director of the National Youth Administration. Met a young fellow by the name of Lyndon Johnson, who was the state director in Texas, putting young people to work in the Depression in this state, and then was with the FBI, the Justice Department, trying and winning civil rights cases in Arkansas. He and my mother were escorted out of the state of Arkansas in 1937, having successfully prosecuted the Ku Klux Klan. I didn't know until a couple of years ago when a person presented me with a paper from Greenville or Spartanburg, South Carolina, where my father had actually prosecuted the Ku Klux Klan and won a case there in 1940. And then, of course, Nuremberg, which was the epiphany in many ways in his life. The idea that somehow that I should be out in the business of redeeming a life that hardly needed redemption, in my view, was something that never, ever crossed my mind. Russell Long, one time, a former senator and son of Huey Long, but senator from Louisiana, one day came up to me and said, you know, I want to offer a resolution. In fact, he did as well as the senator from Ohio, I'm trying to think which one, said, we'd like to offer a resolution to exonerate your father. We feel we've been through the record of this thing really was a travesty, and he ought to be exonerated. And I said, you know, frankly, I don't think he needs that. And every day I'm here doing my work, in a sense, probably to some people may solve that issue. So despite the effort of fellow senators, in fact, in the case of the Ohio senator, never served with my father, but read the entire record, which I never knew until he had done so, and decided that that this was one where exoneration might have been appropriate. But I always felt that would have been a mistake.
Knowing how painful that was for him and how that turned out, then I think about how painful it must have been for you when the Ethics Committee was looking into the mortgage situation. Now, you were cleared and all of that, but at that point, I wondered how you felt.
Well, it does. Anytime you listen, anyone who has ever been in public life, when you get an accusation, obviously everybody knows about it. It's not one of these things that is private, so you're sitting there in sort of a free fall. I mean, there were those who said, why don't you just admit you did something wrong? Well, I've never been opposed to admitting something and do something wrong. Lord knows in public life, votes you cast or things that you'd like to have back. But I couldn't in good conscience, having never felt there was anything done wrong. But it took 17 or 18 months for a bipartisan committee to unanimously conclude there wasn't anything wrong. But in the meantime, you had obviously the stories being written and the like. So it's painful to go through that. But that's the business of being in public life. I mean, that's what happens. And it's harmful. And I know that people look at you a little bit differently, put it mildly, and you wish you were otherwise. But if you're not prepared in a public life to have those days and moments when they occur, then you probably should be careful about getting involved in it. So you wish it didn't happen. You wish they'd reached decisions earlier. But again, I'm grateful to the committee that reached the same conclusion that I felt was justified. But those are the sort of feelings you have.
Senator, there are so many questions I could ask you about so much significant legislation that you've been responsible for. But I guess what I want to know is, what do you look at as your greatest achievement over these years? And what was the greatest disappointment in your career?
Well, those are more time, I think, to think about that. And but instead of thinking about a specific issue, I always thought the best United States senators. When I got in 1981, came to the Senate, I looked around and I said, who have been the great senators, and how do they conduct themselves, and what do they do? And to me, the best senators were the people who didn't try to become what we call, I guess, a jack of all issues. There are those I've served with, no matter what the subject matter, I had a speech or I had an amendment to offer on everything. And I'd say respectfully, but weren't terribly effective on anything as a result, because they seemed to be involved in everything. The people that I thought made the significant contributions were people who either brought an expertise or developed an expertise and certain subject matters, and spent their time concentrating on them, even when they weren't topical in a way, but developed a knowledge base over them. Sam Nunn, I mentioned earlier, is a wonderful example of that. Is someone I served with. Bob Dole, Howard Baker was in many ways. I can think of others that I served with who demonstrated that kind of model. And so the three issues that I got involved in were children's issues as a group. There was no caucus or involvement in children's issues in the United States Senate. The second was Latin America. Pat generously talked about my Peace Corps experience in Latin America, and I had a knowledge and interest in the subject matter, and there doesn't seem to be anybody else who was really interested in the subject matter on the Foreign Relations Committee. And then thirdly was the financial services area. Again, Connecticut depends on this largely. Obviously, our insurance companies, as well as those who work in the financial sector. And I was on the banking committee, and so it seemed a natural enough fit. So those are the three cluster areas. It doesn't mean I wasn't uninterested in environmental issues and labor issues, Leo, and others that came along, but those were the areas where I decided I'd try to carve out a contribution. And of those three, the cluster that gave me the greatest sense of satisfaction were in the children's area. I just can't tell you how much I enjoyed that work. Maybe it's growing up in a large family, being one of 6 children, having siblings that are teachers and have loved their profession over the years. As my father's 3 sisters, my Aunt Catherine taught at Hartford High for 40 years. My Aunt Mary taught at Wyndham High for 40 years, and my Aunt Helen taught at West Haven High for 40 years. Not to mention my sister's contribution. I won't say how many years, Carolyn, you taught. And so having listened to them growing up about their involvement. So when I started the Children's Caucus, and then Orrin Hatch of Utah and I, a very conservative colleague, had the first child care legislation since World War II. And then it was the after-school programs and 21st century learning centers. The Family and Medical Leave Act, it took me 7 or 8 years to pass, went through a lot of vetoes that I did with Dan Coates, who's a new senator again from Ohio, and Kit Bond, a Republican senator from Missouri. 100 million people have now taken advantage of the Family and Medical Leave Act since February of 1993, when it became law. And then all of the related issues on autism, premature births, infant screening, just a whole host of issues that fall into that category are the ones that gave me the most satisfaction. The disappointments are harder because I didn't, even though something didn't get passed, I mean, just by holding hearings and getting involved in the subject matters were important. I wish, in a way, that there could have been more interest in the financial area at a time when things were beginning to happen and people didn't realize it. It was very disappointing. The year of 2007, I became chairman of the banking committee in January of 2007. So it was just 4 years ago. And of course, the world collapsed in 2008. But 2007, I had 80 hearings on the mortgage crisis. And I could not get, and I say this respectfully, I could not get the Bush administration to show any interest in the subject matter. It was incredible to me. It wasn't until the collapse of Bear Stearns on the night of March 16, 2008, and then 6 months later to the day with AIG and Lehman Brothers, and then, of course, the 2 weeks, which will forever be seared in my memory, when Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson came and met with the 12 of us in Nancy Pelosi's office and announced in these words, and I quote them, that unless you act, the 12 of you, in the next few days, the entire financial system of this country and a good part of the world will melt down. Needless to say, took the oxygen out of the room that day. In those 2 weeks of then putting that bill together, which the country rightfully was incensed over, that they were being asked to write a $700 billion check, their money, to bail out financial institutions, many of which had contributed to the problem, was a very difficult moment, and yet had to be done. I'll also go to my grave believing had we not done it, this country would be a very different place today, economically. Not that it's great, but we're in better shape to recover than we would have been had we not engaged in that effort. So that disappointment would be one of them that occurred to me over the last couple of years, that we didn't get more done.
Well, these people have questions. In fact, they were calling us, telling us what they wanted to talk about. So I'm going to ask, if you'd like to ask a question, please stand up and we'll call on you. And
yeah,
right
Chris.
here.
I heard you speak, and I was never surprised at why you got into children's issues in Latin America and the banking.
Yeah.
But you were an early proponent of the fire service before 9/11, before it was recognized as a national issue. And I'm curious, I've never known why. What brought you to that?
Well, first off, truth in advertising, Chris is a firefighter,
Yes.
and here in Connecticut, we've been friends for a long time. There was the Worcester fire before 9/11, in which up the road from us here in Connecticut, a tragedy. And I remember learning, and again, there's been a lot of examination of what occurred, but these heat detectors were not available. It seemed to me here we were at the end of the 20th century and had the capacity to do so many things technologically, and here we were sending men and women into flaming buildings without the technology that would allow them to determine what they were walking into. And I thought that it didn't make a lot of sense. We had already done the COPS program nationally to provide resources back to the states, an idea that came from New Haven, Connecticut, actually, and it worked pretty well, getting resources back to our police departments. And crime rates declined because we had more people we could put on the streets in the law enforcement areas, providing resource and technology to them. And it seemed to me that this was a legitimate area. Firefighters and EMS services and the like could need the support. I'll take advantage of Chris's question. It's a great story, and having never taken a political science course in my life, I was an English literature major, which may explain some of the problems I had with this. But the question I get a lot from students is, well, how does a bill become law? And I introduced this bill to establish what they call the fire grant program. There have been out, I think, 50,000 grants that have gone out under that program that I authored back almost 15, 16 years ago. And I'm trying to get it done, and it wasn't working well. I wasn't getting much support for it. People really weren't interested, and it seemed like a lot of money, and was it really going to make a difference? And John Warner, my friend from Virginia, Republican Senator from Virginia, who chaired the Armed Services Committee, was on the floor one day with his defense authorization bill. And I went down to John and I said, this is a bill, I think it makes sense, and communities could use the help, and we need to modernize the equipment they get. They can't do pancake breakfast to pay for this stuff. I mean, we're a different world today, and they need the support. And so he listened to me, and I said, would you let me bring up this amendment on the defense authorization bill? And he said, well, this is a defense. What are you bringing up a fire bill on the defense authorization bill? I said, well, not many other people are interested. So he said, let me think about it. And about 20 minutes later, he called me and I said, if you come up here at about 5:30 this afternoon, let's bring it up. We'll talk about it. Let's see what happens. Well, I said, that's pretty good. So I came back at 5:30 and I offered the thing. There was no one around, and the bill went through. Not bad. Well, I always wondered, why did John let me do this? And so I said to him, how did this happen, John? I appreciate you think I'm a nice guy and we're friends, but this is a pretty big hunk of change to support our fire departments around the country. He said, I have a woman working for me who was a staff director at the time of the Armed Services Committee, and she heard this conversation on the floor of the Senate. And after I walked away, she leaned over to him, according to John, and said, my father was a fire chief, and I've never asked you to do anything. But I know what it's like to see these men go out and put their lives at risk every single day for our communities. And I've never asked you anything before, but could you give this bill a shot and a chance? And John said, well, if you said that, it means that much and has that much value to it, let's give it a shot. And that's how it became law.
That's great. Now, usually we wrap these things up at 1, and I know some people have to leave because they're on lunch hour, but we started late, so we're going to go a little longer. Professor Warshauer.
Thank you for service, Senator. You had mentioned the economic meltdown a few years ago, and I'm curious to know your thoughts about that. It seems from what happened with us with the Great Depression that the nation actually learned some hard lessons as a result and imposed some financial regulations that were very important over the years, things like Glass-Steagall.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are in regards to this, and if we merely put a Band-Aid on something and kick the economic can down the road without solving the problems.
I don't think we have, and again, great question, and just to paraphrase, this is in light of what happened with the financial services area and the reforms, have we merely just kicked the problem further down the road without really addressing the underlying cause? First of all, my view is there are multiple underlying causes, but the principal underlying cause was, to me, the philosophical debate which had gone on whether or not you let the market regulate, or do you actually have a system of regulation in place so that where risk particularly is going to be a greater calculation than it had been. I often cite the example in Washington where Pennsylvania Avenue and Constitution Avenue come together is the Federal Trade Commission. And if you've been to Washington, there's a piece of statuary outside of that building which looks like some Stalinist art. I think it was built in the 1930s, but it shows this horse, which is a muscular horse, and there's a man holding back the horse, and you're not sure whether the horse is winning or the man is winning in this contest of strength. And so you're left wondering who's going to prevail. And I've often thought symbolically that's what this ought to be. You want a robust financial services sector in our country. It's been a source of great wealth creation. It helped produce a middle class in our country, home ownership and the like. But you also don't want to run wild on you, as we saw it happen, in my view, beginning back in 2003 and 4 and 5, long before 2007 or 2008. And what happened is there was a conscious decision to basically deregulate. In January of 2007, as the new chairman of the banking committee, I can't tell you how many people came knocking on my door in January saying, you know, look, if you don't have more deregulation of financial services, we're all going to go to London. We're going to leave the country. I mean, if that happened once, it happened 50 times coming in. I've subsequently found out that same argument was being made in London, by the way. If you don't deregulate there, we're all going to go to New York. So, and there's kind of an argument that we're leaving the country because you're getting too restrictive. So it wasn't a question this was, as I say, a conscious decision to occur out of the Federal Reserve System as well as out of the Department of the Treasury and elsewhere. So more than anything else, it was that, in my view. So in crafting the alternatives, which I spent 2 years doing, it's designed to do several things. One is to make sure that we harmonize with the world, so we don't have what I call sovereign arbitrage. That is that same argument. If you don't do this, we're going to go someplace else, where you get the European Union, the Asian communities, that we're all sort of on the same page. So we get away from this racing around the country, what Arthur Burns, a former head of the Federal Reserve, used to call the race to the bottom globally. Secondly, you wanted to make sure that you were going to have a system in place that would not stifle the innovation and creativity that has been the source of employment in our nation, job creation, as well as wealth creation and the like. And that's critically important, that you want people to be innovative and creative. But at the same time, you want to make sure we have the ability to spot risk, to set standards on liquidity, on capital, so that things don't get out of control, as they did. And that's the balance you're trying to strike. It's never perfect, but you've got to try and strike that balance. So by establishing an oversight council, where again we can spot problems both in terms of product or the size of institutions that subject our financial system to systemic risk and the like, I think can help tremendously. A Consumer Protection Bureau. This was one of the biggest battles I had. The idea that there isn't some place where the average consumer can go to get a redress of grievances in financial service. You buy a faulty product, a toaster or a TV, and if it doesn't work, you can go to the Consumer Product Safety Commission and get redress for that problem. Where do you go when someone shoves a mortgage in your face that you don't understand that causes you to go bankrupt? Or what other financial instrument? So by establishing that, I think we've done also a lot in terms of providing some protection for people against some of the abuses that occurred in the past. And we've left a lot of this to the regulators, and I realize that. But in 1933, when the Bank Act was written, it was 29 pages long. Joe Kennedy got the entire job, basically, as the first chairman of the SEC. And when we wrote the legislation creating the SEC and the FDIC as well, those were relatively short bills, and everything was left to the regulators to determine. I didn't do that with this bill. We left a lot for regulators because, frankly, the nuances of proprietary trading, the derivatives market, is something you don't want to leave to 535 members of Congress to decide. With all due respect to my colleagues, this isn't exactly their expertise, in a way, of doing this. So we'll see what the regulators do. In my view, if I were in Congress today, I'd want this Congress to be an oversight Congress on health care and on financial reform. We pass these major bills. Are they working right? Are they doing what you thought they'd do? Are they really providing the kind of cost reduction and protections people need? And anyone who tells you they have absolutely doesn't know what they're talking about. I'll guarantee you we made mistakes in this. And this ought to be a time to evaluate whether those bills really are doing what we hoped they would do. And watching the regulators. What are they doing? Calling them up before Congress. How are you proceeding on those regulations? What are they actually going to achieve and accomplish? Would be a great contribution in my view. So I have a lot of hope that actually what we've done will work and make a difference. And while we'll have crises, clearly in the future, our ability to manage those crises so they don't run out of control, as this one did, posing or putting us in such great risk as this set of problems did. Sorry about the length of the answer, but that's a thing, yeah.
Yeah.
Along with helping the financial institutions, should we have helped the people who were losing their homes because they couldn't pay their mortgage?
Well, it did, and I thought there should have been. I mean, early on, in fact, we tried to get these banks and others to step back. It seemed to me make more sense to try and keep someone in a home who could afford to stay there, than rather than putting them out and having that property deteriorate. Every foreclosed piece of property in a square block causes the property value of every other home in that block to decline immediately that day by 5%. And when you end up with 2 foreclosed properties or 3, you begin to watch a neighborhood that's otherwise stable, even during difficult times, begin to drop dramatically. I mean, how many of us have driven around a neighborhood and looked and all of a sudden seen foreclosed properties and then all of a sudden say, well, wait a minute, I'm not sure I want to be in this neighborhood. Or would you like to own a home in that block where all of a sudden everything else is falling apart? So for the life of me, I had a hard time understanding why these institutions didn't see in their self-interest the value of trying to keep people that you could. There were some people, candidly, who were lured into financial arrangements and never explained what the fully indexed price would be of that adjustable rate mortgage, when they knew very well what it be, the institution did, and knowing full well that individual was never going to be able to meet those obligations here. And that, frankly, there wasn't something you could do. The best you could do there is probably get the person out, help them in some way to get into a rental property or something else they could afford. Okay?
Congress couldn't do anything about it.
Well, we did, and so they kept writing stuff on the thing, but obviously the institutions, they're the ones holding the mortgages. You just can't sit there. We tried to do something with, we call these the cram downs, but we never had more than 30 votes to support that. I supported it, but I could never get more than 32 votes in the Senate. Yeah.
Over here? Yes, sir.
Senator, I was wondering if you have any comments on the perception that both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal have. When they agree on something, I think the truth is probably close to being right, that President Obama has pivoted to the center post the election with a more friendly business attitude with Bill Daley and some other measures that he's proposed. Is that a correct perception?
Well,
is that a wise move by his part, if so?
Yeah, I don't think it's a sort of all of a sudden a sort of a road to Damascus kind of conversion here. I mean, having known Barack Obama as a colleague in the Senate and having spent a little time with him on the road in 2007, not that anyone paid much attention to Joe Biden, and that, I was to say teasing, but he was. This is not a different Barack Obama, in my view. He was a moderate member of the Senate, in my view, on these issues. I think the fact that so much time was spent because of the economic problems of the country. He was handed a remarkable set of problems on January 20th, 2009, unlike anything any other president other than Franklin Roosevelt was given. He made the decision, in my view, to take on the health care debate, an economic issue, I might add, aside from all the other human factors associated with that issue. And he will be defined historically by financial reform and health care, in my view. There are other issues. And had he not done those things or succeeded at them, I think he'd be in a lot worse trouble politically today. So the fact that he is now shifting and focusing on these other issues, I don't see as some fundamental alteration of his philosophy or ideology. I just think it's a new set of issues. Pat Moynihan once said something very interesting to me, and a great respect for this remarkable man who was here many times in the state with me on various events. And he used to say in that old inimitable way he'd talk, that he'd say, presidents only get 20 months, Pat would talk. And you only get from inauguration day to the midterm election to really be president. Now, events may happen, catastrophes, natural or otherwise, to which you have to respond. But if you want to initiate anything on your own as a president, you only get that window to do so. The midterm elections after which you're running for re-election. And so you're going to become wrapped up in that. If you get re-elected, you're a lame duck immediately because of the constitutional prohibition against anything more than 2 terms. And therefore, people are already looking to the next administration almost before you're sworn in. So it is that 20 months. From January 20th until midterm elections, although in this case he had a little bit of help in the lame duck session as well. And I think Barack Obama, again, putting aside whether you liked or disliked all the things that happened, defined his presidency in that 20 months, in a way, on health care and on getting our country back, at least heading in the right direction. And to me, the fact that he's now moving to these other issues of getting unemployment rates down and again, watching an economy grow is, I think we're overreading this. I think the pundits and the 24-hour cable television is grappling around and reading into every nuanced meeting and gathering that happens something fundamentally different that I don't think really exists.
You don't think an ex-banker is his head of staff?
No, Bill Daley, I've known Bill for years. I mean, Bill is a great, sobering, mature hand on the political process. And yet, while he spent time at J.P. Morgan and various other places, this is also the guy who grew up in a family, not unmindful of what it takes to win elections and how to run a city. A brother, by anyone's estimation, whether you like him or not, Chicago's a pretty well-run metropolis. He's been the Secretary of Commerce. He was the one who convinced Al Gore not to concede that night, despite many of us disappointed with the final outcome. Al Gore wanted to concede. Bill Daley pulled him back and said, I don't think this race is over with. I mean, this is a pretty sober, smart political guy to have around. And whether you're a governor, a mayor, or a president, you can get a guy like Bill Daley sitting at your side every day. It's pretty smart, in my view. This was a great choice.
We have about 8 minutes left, so I'm going to ask for a few more questions if we can keep them short. Yes. Right here. Would you stand up, please?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
The health care bill, are we going to look at this and say yay pretty soon? It's so confusing, and we don't know what it's going to cost. Since now they're saying, well, maybe it's really, out to the side, they'll say, well, maybe it's really going to cost more than we thought it was going to be. So what's the deal? Are we
Well, it's a great point.
We're going to be able to afford this, and we're going to say we did the right thing.
Yeah.
We support this.
Certainly that's the hope. Look, again, you know all the statistics. And I think if you had to teach a civics class and you wanted on how a bill becomes law, the worst example I could cite was how the health care bill became law. I might say with a sense of pride that the financial reform bill would be an example of how a bill can become law and should become law. On the financial reform, I had 3 weeks of debate on the floor of the Senate, never had a 60-vote requirement on any amendment, 50 votes alone. We carried everything on C-SPAN. People could watch the entire process unfold. And whether you like or dislike the outcome, the public could watch every piece of it, and it was done in public. Healthcare was a mess in terms of how you do it. And so little wonder the public is confused about what's in this and how is this going to work, what the costs are. So your question is one, people aren't as articulate in how you've raised it, but it's the question we all have about how is this actually going to work. I honestly believe that the health care bill, it was absolutely critical. I mean, again, you were looking at a percentage of our gross domestic product that was being consumed by health care costs rising close to that 30%, an untenable number, in which case we're going to have to do something to bring down these costs, as well as to get people away from the most expensive health care in the country, and that is the emergency room, where an awful lot of people are showing up, and do things to get this right. So my hope is, unlike, which I think is a silly exercise, this whole repeal process, while people are uncomfortable about what's in this bill, the idea of going back to where we were under a system that existed a few months ago, prior to the passage of this bill, would be a nightmare for people.
I mean, I hear you selling it now, but nobody's selling it. We don't
Well, they should be, and that's why. And if John Boehner would listen to me, not that he will, that the Speaker of the House, what I would encourage John Boehner to do, instead of having a vote on repealing this, which is basically a political gesture to those who are upset about the bill. It's not a thoughtful analysis of the bill and what's working, what's not working, and getting this right. I listened to President Obama last night, in fact, probably to the disappointment of some, suggested that it's exactly what the House ought to do and the Congress ought to do, to go through the process in the coming weeks to examine this bill more carefully on how it's working and not working. Total repeal of the bill, I think, would be a disaster for the country. I think an analysis of the bill and picking out those areas that aren't working right, educating the American public about what's in it and how it works for them, would be a very valuable use of time in this Congress. Okay?
So we don't have too much time, so thank you for your thoughtful. Yes, the gentleman in the back, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Diane. I really rise just to say thank you, Senator.
Thanks very much.
There's been one thing that's been constant in my life as I became voter age, was that you have been my committed, compassionate, articulate representative, and you've done so with this gratitude I can't possibly put into words.
Thanks.
But what has sustained you through these years, if I have to ask a question, would be the question, what has sustained me? Very, very few short list of people, and you're certainly one on that list. Had the opportunity to shake your hands many times over the last 3 or 4 decades. working in state and local government, General Assembly, having a major hand in the election of Hartford's first properly elected black mayor, Thurman Milner. So I have a lot of commitment to our city, the election process, and to just being involved. And so my question would be, again, heartfelt, thank you, thank God for you, but what has sustained you through all these years? What has kept the motor running?
Well, that's a great question, and probably want to be careful in time, but in answering it, we live in the most remarkable country ever envisioned, with all of our shortcomings, and again, always trying to get better at what the founders talked about, that more perfect union. And we're not there yet, but we're trying all the time. And having been allowed by a constituency to be directly involved in that process of getting us closer, or trying to, here has been such a gift that more than anything else is what's the same. When I sit and look, and I had in my office a copy of a painting of Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth. I sit in Roger Sherman's seat in the Senate. There have been 55 of us in Connecticut since 1789 that have served in the United States Senate. Joe Liebman and my dad sat in the Oliver Ellsworth seat going back. And to know, looking back at the people who've represented our interests and served, and know that you're just part of a handful, fewer people that are gathered here in this room today, and since 1789 have had the privilege of being United States Senator from the state. Those two individuals, by the way, of course, created the United States Senate, the Connecticut Compromise, which, in the absence of which would have caused, I think most agree, the Constitution Convention to collapse, because large states, small states were bickering, and Sherman and Ellsworth came up with the idea of a bicameral system whereby one chamber would have equal representation regardless of the size of the state, and also where minority voices had to be heard, which is, Pat sort of referenced this in my reverence of the institution. I worry today that people are trying to make the Senate look like the House of Representatives, which would be a travesty in my view, that you need to listen to minority voices, and the Senate was the place where even it gets uncomfortable and frustrating and the like, a democracy depends upon people being heard. The e pluribus unum. The unum is the House in some way. The pluribus is the Senate. And I'm a great advocate of a partisan debate. I think a partisan... Can you imagine what that Constitutional Convention was like? You think Adams and Jefferson, were embracing each other every day? Hell no, they were fighting with each other. They had different ideas on how this ought to work. And yet they did so ultimately. They didn't have to worry about some of the technology that exists today in terms of being criticized for their battles and fights they were having. But that idea of having a partisan conversation and debate about who we are and what we wanted to become based on a set of values it has been critical. And the Senate is the place that can happen. And so while it's been frustrating and filibusters and the like can drive you to distraction, you got to step back all the time and remind yourself, you're a temporary custodian. That's all you are. Whether you serve for 2 days or 30 years in that institution. And your job is to not only do what you can to advance that cause of achieving that more just society, but also to preserve the ability for an institution to allow those voices to be heard, even when it gets frustrating. I remember as a kid, and Pat talked about growing up around all of this, when I was a page for one summer, an unpaid page in the floor of the United States Senate for some of the all-night debates on civil rights. What an education process for a 14 or 15-year-old, to be sitting there and listening to some of the giants of the early 1960s argue about whether or not we could be a more just society, making sure that every human being in this country, regardless of race or religion, but particularly race in those days, could be included in the business. And to hear those debates back and forth that occurred, and ultimately producing the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 65, and knowing that I was in that same chamber to be engaged in the debates in our day about what ought to be done to end a war in Central America, provide a family and medical leave policy, or to see to it we could have a financial oversight responsibility to give people a sense of fairness, to me was as sustaining as anything. How could you not, in my view, to be in that place in these times to make that kind of a difference? And so more than anything else, again, as I said at the outset, there's no way, as rich as our language is, the English language, in its diversity, there are not adjectives that I'm aware of that could begin to describe my sense of gratitude to the people of Connecticut for having given me and my family a chance to represent you in the halls of the United States Congress.
Senator, I can't think of a better note to end on. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank Thank you.